I have told this story maybe a dozen times over the years, and every time I do, someone at the table goes quiet. Not the dramatic kind of quiet, where they're waiting for the twist. The other kind, where they've already understood and there's nothing useful left to say. It was the Remembrance vigil at Thornwall Square. If you don't know Thornwall, it's a garrison town, the kind that has lost enough men over enough generations that the cenotaph in the square isn't decoration, it's weight. The names carved into that pale stone go back 4 wars. Everybody in that town has a surname on it somewhere. Everybody comes to the vigil. Every year on the anniversary, a full dawn-to-dusk watch was maintained by a rotating pair of guards from the household company at Arenthal Barracks, 2 miles east, 2 guards in, 2 guards out every 2 hours. Standard protocol, dignified, precise, never once interrupted. The year I'm talking about, I was a sergeant attached to Arenthal's duty office. I wasn't on the square myself. I was at the barracks, tracking the rotation schedule and handling communications for the day's watch. My friend, I'll call him Pell, which was what everyone called him, though his rank name was Guardsman Pelloran, was assigned the 060 to 08 slot at the cenotaph. First watch of the day. He'd drawn it the previous autumn in the standard lottery and had not complained once. Pell never complained. That was simply who he was. 22 years in the household company, and I had never heard the man gripe about a posting, a duty assignment, or a meal. At 0530, the weather reports changed. What had been a forecast for overcast skies turned, inside 40 minutes, into something the meteorologists later described as an event system, the kind of language they use when a storm decides to stop being polite. By 0545, the wind had come up off the eastern plain at a speed that knocked a delivery lorry sideways on the high road into Thornwall. By 0600, when Pell and his partner from first rotation, Guardsman Hale, marched to their posts at the base of the cenotaph, the rain was coming in sideways, and the square's stone flags were running with an inch of moving water. I heard about what happened next from 3 separate sources, each of them watching from different vantage points around the square, and their accounts match on every point that matters. Pell and Hale took their positions on either side of the cenotaph's base. The standard posture, rifles held vertical, chins level, eyes forward. The ceremony had already drawn a thin crowd of residents who, despite the weather, had come out to mark the day. Town council members stood under the colonnade of the civic hall. A handful of elderly residents sat under umbrellas that the wind kept turning inside out. A woman I later learned was the great-granddaughter of one of the names on the stone, stood at the edge of the square holding femflowers that the rain was already destroying. By 0615, the wind had reached the kind of force that makes walking difficult. Umbrellas gave up entirely and were folded or abandoned. The crowd thinned. Most of the council members retreated inside. The woman with the flowers didn't move, but she had gone white with cold. Pell didn't move. Hale was, by his own account, struggling, not with discipline, but with the physical reality of keeping a vertical rifle steady in a crosswind that was now gusting hard enough to shift a man's center of gravity. At 0630, the duty officer at Arenthal, not me, a lieutenant named Forshaw, made the call I would have expected any reasonable officer to make. He authorized the early relief of both guards. He picked up the radio and told Pell and Hale they were to return to barracks as soon as their replacements reached the square. The replacements were already being suited out. Hale received the message and acknowledged it. Pell did not respond. I was in the duty office when Forshaw tried the radio a second time. Static, then nothing. The storm had chewed the signal. Forshaw dispatched the relief pair immediately, figuring the message had gotten through and Pell would comply once he saw them arrive. The relief pair, Guardsmen Dowd and Cairns, drove the 2 miles from Arenthal in a vehicle that was being pushed across the road by the wind and arrived at Thornwall Square at 0648. What they found was this: Hale, standing as upright as he could manage, face raw with cold, holding his post, and Pell, at the other side of the cenotaph space, motionless. I mean genuinely motionless, not the performative stillness of a guard in fair weather, but something that looked, in Dowd's words, like the stone itself had put on a uniform. Water was sheeting down his bare skin. His medals were soaked flat against his tunic. His white gloves had gone gray from the rain. His eyes were forward. Dowd stepped up to him and told him directly relief was here. The duty officer had authorized early rotation. They were to return to barracks. Pell said nothing. Dowd, uncertain what he was dealing with, radioed back to Forshaw. Forshaw, to his credit, did not overreact. He asked Dowd to repeat the authorization clearly, ensure Pell had heard it, and stand by. Dowd did exactly that. He stood in front of Pell, close enough that there was no question the message was landing, and read out the duty officer's authorization word for word. Pell's eyes did not shift. His posture did not change. His voice, when it came, was quiet, so quiet that Dowd had to lean in to hear it over the wind. I have the post. That was all. Dowd later told me that he had been in the household company for 6 years at that point, and had never in his life heard 4 words carry that much. Wait. He stepped back. He radioed Forshaw. Forshaw was quiet for a moment. Then he said, stand them with him. So Dowd and Cairns took flanking positions at the cenotaph. 4 guards now, instead of 2, in a storm that by 0700 had driven the last of the onlookers from the square entirely, almost. The woman with the destroyed flowers was still there. A man in a waxed coat who turned out to be a retired warrant officer from the 3rd Regiment had appeared at the edge of the square and was simply standing with his hands at his sides. A boy of perhaps 12 in a waterproof, pulled over his school clothes, was sitting on the Civic Hall steps under an overhang, watching. His grandmother, one of Thornwall's longest-serving counselors, had apparently not been able to persuade him to go inside. At 0720, Hale's rotation ended. He was relieved and returned to barracks. He later told me he'd cried on the drive back, though he said it with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who has made his peace with it. Pell held his post. The storm peaked between 0730 and 0745. Forshaw, monitoring the weather on the barracks instruments, told me afterward that the recorded wind speed during that window was the highest logged at Thornwall in 11 years. The rain was horizontal. The flags on the Civic Hall had been brought in at 0700 as a precaution. The square was empty of everyone except 4 guards and 2 civilians who refused to leave, the woman in the open, the retired warrant officer at the edge, and the boy on the steps. Forshaw came to the square himself at 0750. He parked at the north entrance and walked across in full uniform, his cap brim pressed flat by the wind, and he stood. He didn't interfere with the post. He didn't speak to Pell. He simply came and stood where the people of that town were supposed to stand on this day, in the storm, because one of his men was already doing it. At 0800, Pell's assigned rotation ended. The relief had been standing beside him for over an hour. The changeover was conducted with full ceremony, the slow, precise movements, the rifle exchange, every step of the protocol observed exactly as it would have been on a calm morning in June. No shortcuts. No acknowledgement of the weather, no expression on Pell's face other than the one he'd brought to the post. When it was done, Pell turned from the cenotaph for the first time in 2 hours and began the march back across the square. And that is the moment I can't get out of my head, even now. The woman with the flowers was standing at the edge of the flagstones, and as Pell passed her, she said something. I have heard different accounts of exactly what, but the version I believe is simply, thank you. Nothing more. And Pell, who had stood through 2 hours of a record storm, without breaking composure, without acknowledging the cold, without answering the radio, without responding to a direct authorization to leave, stopped for precisely 1 step, not a full halt, not a turn, just a pause in his stride, a fraction of a second, before he continued marching. The retired warrant officer came to attention as Pell passed him and held it until Pell was out of the square. I was told that the boy on the steps stood up. The story did not make the news that day. It circulated through the town, through the civic council, through the veterans associations, through the families whose names were on the stone. By the following week it had moved wider. Through the regiment's network, through garrison communities Arenthal had served for 3 decades. By the Remembrance vigil the following year, the crowd in Thornwall Square had doubled. The year after, it doubled again. I don't think Pell ever fully understood why. I asked him once, years later, what had been going through his head during those 2 hours. He thought about it the way he always did, as if an answer not properly considered wasn't worth speaking. Then he said, those names on the stone didn't get to leave their post. He poured the tea, and that was the end of it. I have thought about those 8 words more times than I can count. No bravado in them, no performance, no invitation to argue. Just the arithmetic of the thing, the cleanest explanation I have ever heard for what it means to stand a watch that costs you something. You do not leave your post because the men whose names you are standing for did not get to leave theirs. In the years since, the vigil at Thornwall has become what it should always have been, a full day's event attended by the whole town, with the household company holding an unbroken watch from dawn to dusk, regardless of the weather. That is now written into the standing orders. Nobody from Arenthal had to ask for it. The garrison command put it there themselves the winter after the storm. Pell retired from the household company 2 years ago. At his retirement ceremony, the regimental sergeant major, a man not given to sentiment, said that the Guardsman Pelloran had demonstrated on a square in Thornwall in a storm what the word post means. The room was quiet after that, the good kind of quiet.